For Habitus, we're quite committed to doing work where we can build a lot of community voice, that we have a social justice aim to the work that we're doing, and that the outcome has a life beyond the project itself. And we saw a lot of that potential within this project. I think when it comes to racism and Islamophobia, these are becoming such important issues in Alberta, and I think for me personally, seeing the change of the demographics of people who are moving to Alberta more broadly over the last 10 years, for example, really drives it home how important this is to people and to Alberta itself. We want to make sure that this is a welcoming community for everybody to come and settle, and I think for me personally that's very important. But I think more broadly for Habitus Consulting, we've worked a lot in the immigrant sector, and we've seen these issues. We've seen how racism and Islamophobia impact people, their settlement outcomes, how they actually manage to settle and thrive in Canada. And so I think being able to address some of those issues through this work was really important. And like I said, you know, the opportunity for this work to live beyond the project, I think in building the practice guide and knowing that that's sort of what we were steering towards with some sort of toolkit, knowing that organizations broadly across Alberta, not just within the settlement sector, that they were going to be able to use these tools, that they were going to be able to put in place these principles within their work, that was really important because we know that from our experience, from our interviews, we know that people are struggling with how to actually address and deal with issues of racism and Islamophobia in their work. We also know that people are desperate for an opportunity to be able to speak about these issues. And so being able to come together, speak about the issues, develop a toolkit, a practice guide for them to be able to use in their own work was really important to us. We're really interested in processes, projects, programs, organizations that are interested in building community voice within their programs. When it comes to racism and Islamophobia, I think we found, even through the research that we did, was that it's experienced in a variety of different ways. There's no one approach to racism and Islamophobia. There's no one experience of racism and Islamophobia. And so the approach that was taken within this project, I think, was really important because we had an advisory group of key members of the community that could come in and give us strong advice on you know, what were the real needs. We were able to do some good solid data collection, build a really robust evidence base around this work, and build in people's voices and experiences through the survey and through those in-depth interviews. The other piece that I really enjoyed about this particular project was our workshop. It was an opportunity for everyone to come together, and it was wonderful that ASA was able to actually bring people from across Alberta to participate in such a meaningful dialogue. And I think what was really great in that approach was the feedback that we got from people. So people were telling us, you know, this is a wonderful opportunity because we don't have the chance to talk about these issues. And it's interesting because in that approach then, we are able to sort of look at pan-Alberta, at all of the different experiences. It wasn't just about racism in Edmonton, Lethbridge, Red Deer, Medicine Hat. It was about racism and Islamophobia and the experience of it across Alberta and what we're going to do as Albertans on this. So I think, yeah, so that part of the approach and sort of the iterative process where we never knew exactly what we were going to end up with at the end, we really let that be crafted by the evidence, by what people were telling us in the interviews, what people told us in the surveys, and what people told us in the workshop. So, you know, I think combined, I think that's a really strong approach to building projects is developing the evidence, the knowledge, and then being able to mobilize that knowledge within the community space. And that's why I think even the next step of this project is really interesting because now we get to take it public. We get to put it out there and say, so what are you going to do with this toolkit? What are you going to do with a practice guide that is going to inform your work, inform ASA, and inform people across Alberta? I hope that it has a life outside of itself. One of the things that we do at Habitus is we look for projects that are going to have a longevity and a sustainability to them. I think one of the best things that I can ever say is when a project lives off of the shelf, We don't want to be able to just develop a practice guide that people consult from time to time and then put it back on their shelves. We want this to be something that's in their hands, that's guiding them through their difficult decision making, and that is living beyond that, so that they actually feel like, you know what, if this really worked well for me, I'm going to tell ASA about that, and we're going to build that together and make this stronger. You could look at impact in a couple of different ways with this project. I think the short-term impacts would be how settlement practitioners, how community workers are actually going to use these principles and the guidelines that we've put around them to be able to make really good decisions around their projects, how they interact with their clients, even how an organization itself creates a welcoming space within it. That would be a wonderful sort of short-term impact. I think in terms of a long-term impact, I would be looking for the settlement sector more broadly to look at this as principles that they could use to drive a lot of their different work. So for example, I was thinking, for an organization to look at these key principles and say that they want to adapt them, they want to adopt them, they want to put them into practice within their organization, so that when they are developing projects, regardless of whether or not they're, overtly about racism or Islamophobia, but at least they're reflecting around those key principles so that they can develop those stronger programs. I think the settlement sector is in a very strong position to be able to actually be on the front foot and respond to racism and Islamophobia quickly, strongly, and with a great solid backing of years and years of decades of experience of working with people who are coming into this country and experiencing that. So I hope that this is a bit of a call to action to organizations as well, to say, you know what, racism and Islamophobia is happening within our communities and this is our response. So I think this is the first step, but from the response that I've heard from different organizations within the settlement sector, but also from other community organizations that have heard about this project, there's so much appetite. And they really want something to sort of come together to build a community of practice, to come up with these action plans. So I'm hopeful that in the long term it will have that kind of an impact. For me, a practice guide differs from a toolkit in one very particular way. A practice guide is not necessarily, it isn't about outlining a process that everybody should follow. It outlines instead key principles that should guide our thinking. I think, just as an aside, you don't have to include this, but is that a lot of our decision making within the sector doesn't always follow a very clear path. No one problem looks the same to everyone, and when we talk about what racism and Islamophobia looks like, it looks very different to everybody. It can be about, bullying in a school. It can be about a frontline experience with your physician, your family physician, or it can be a random act of violence on the street. And when we talk about racism and Islamophobia, we talk a lot about intersectionality. We talk about the fact that the experience of racism or Islamophobia actually is hard to sort of put your finger on because so many other things are at play: your gender, your education, your socioeconomic status. And so when you're dealing with a very complicated problem like racism and Islamophobia, developing a single toolkit as a response to that didn't seem right for us now. What felt right for us was that we develop principles that instead are able to guide what kind of decision making is being made. So I call them almost like signposts. They help give you directions along the way, much in the way that we would think of a program planning kind of model, where you make key decisions around your program, what sort of outputs you want to have, what sort of activities you're going to have, what sort of funding criteria there are. This is a very similar kind of process. It's a circle where you're allowed to say, okay, so what is the problem that we're trying to address, and what is our position with respect to that problem? Those are some key principles around that. Then planning out activities. How do we plan out those activities within the community that actually augment and leverage community voices? How do we then understand the impact of those projects or those activities or even those interventions at a front-facing client level? How do we measure it? How do we talk about it? How do we make sure that other people know about it? And then again, come back to the program planning cycle of how do we do it all again? So for me, those key principles that we've developed will help guide people through their decision making. Like I said, it's a reflexive piece where people can actually just look at those and say, you know what, have we adequately looked at, you know, all the different intersecting factors within this person's life that's leading to this experience? Have we really built in community voice within the response? How do we know that we're actually having an impact on anti-racism and anti-Islamophobia, you know? How are we measuring it? How are we talking about it? So for me, the principles of the practice guide just help us guide our actions along the way.